Do 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 do. Oh man, there's a new Mario and Luigi game out? That's funny. I thought the company that made those went out of business. Huh. And it looks like IGN gave it a 5 out of 10. Whew, that's harsh. Hey, hold on a minute. IGN learned how to count? So, in case you've been living under a ho-ho stone for the last couple of months, let me be the first to say, welcome to the world of tomorrow! And also, yes, they did make a new Mario and Luigi game recently, even though AlphaDream, the company that originally created the Mario and Luigi franchise and developed every game in said franchise for more than a decade, sadly went bankrupt in 2019, leaving a big bean-shaped hole in all our hearts. This new entry, Mario and Luigi Brothership, was instead developed by Acquire, a Japanese game developer that's actually been responsible for several middlingly successful franchises, dating all the way back to the late 90s, but which is probably most famous these days for partnering with Square Enix to develop the Octopath Traveler games. Octopath is something of a polarizing series, with some players claiming that it's almost single-handedly carrying the torch of classic-style Japanese RPGs into the future, and others claiming that it's a boring, grindy pile of crap. So it was something of a risk for Nintendo to outsource a once-beloved sub-series to this team. After all, they have had trouble getting the most out of new partners working with older, niche franchises before. But in this case, it seems that the reviews mostly bear out the wisdom of their choice to work with Acquire. Mostly. Which brings us to the best part of any new release these days, the controversy. Virtually alone among the big review sites, IGN decided that Brothership wasn't even worthy of a 7 out of 10, which memesters like to point out is usually the lowest score they give any game from a major publisher. Even legendarily critical reviews from IGN, like the one for the Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire remakes in which the reviewer cited too much water as one of the game's major cons, tend to hover around the 8 out of 10 mark. Brothership got a 5 out of 10, which for a site with IGN's track record may as well be a flat 0. What made the talk soup even spicier is the fact that just a few months before, the site had given a 7 out of 10 to Sony's Concord, a multiplayer hero shooter which was so unbelievably terrible that, well, it is almost literally true to say that no one bought it. A month after Brothership's release, the most famous thing about it is still this brutally harsh IGN review, which has drawn more attention to the site and its practices than it's received in years. If they planned this whole thing as a publicity stunt to get more site traffic, I don't think they could have done it better. So, is that what they were doing? Honestly, I don't think so. We have to remember that this is not the first time a major publication has put the smackdown on a Mario RPG. In fact, one of the most infamous scores in game reviewing history appeared in Game Informer magazine's review of possibly the most lauded Mario RPG ever, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, which just got remade last year and sold almost as many copies in that form as it did 20 years ago on the GameCube. Now, this review wasn't quite as harsh as IGN is being toward Brothership. Lisa Mason, who was, generally speaking, one of the more open-minded reviewers at Game Informer, gave it a 6.75 out of 10, and her colleague, Jeremy Zoss, gave it a 6. But the real slap in the face was what they actually said about it. The review is subtitled, The Million-Year Bore. Lisa complained that the game stayed really easy most of the time, which, to be fair, is practically undeniable. She applauded the combat and the art style, but what really seems to have gotten on her nerves was the same thing that most fans of the game love to death, the writing. She called it witless and dull. She referred to the dialogue as downright shameful and groan-inducing banter, and insisted that not a single line of it was, this is her word, worthwhile. She said that the plot was below the standards of a soap opera, and finished by condescendingly conceding that maybe none of this matters to people who like the game, because they are, statistically speaking, 9 years old. In keeping with his lower score, Jeremy was even more dismissive, referring to the first Paper Mario as juvenile and boring, and saying that the Thousand-Year Door was essentially the same game. Both reviewers anticipated that their opinions would provoke a backlash from Nintendo fans, but they also insisted that this was the way they really felt, and the scores were a reflection of how much fun the game was for them. I was a subscriber to Game Informer when this game came out, and while I didn't get around to playing it right away, I can tell you that when I finally did, rereading this review made my blood boil. How dare they say this game's writing sucked? What were they even comparing it to that was supposedly so much more adult? Some melodramatic, wannabe philosophical snooze fest like Final Fantasy VIII? Or a meat-headed action movie pastiche power fantasy like Devil May Cry? They gave both of those games a 9.5 out of 10, and the reviews barely even mentioned the story, even though Final Fantasy VIII is a freaking RPG. And seriously, if you think the low challenge in Paper Mario is an impediment to fun, you get to the bottom of the pit of 100 trials, and then see if you can say with a straight face that there's no challenge here, or that the combat is too simple for you to really express yourself through gameplay. But as I grew older, and continued to replay the Thousand Year Door every couple of years or so, a lot of that anger disappeared. Partly this was because the general consensus now much more closely reflected my opinion that the game was great, and one mean-spirited review from an increasingly irrelevant and now defunct print magazine didn't sting as much as it used to. It also has to be said, though, that after my most recent playthrough, which was just a few months ago, I kind of get what they were talking about. It's not that I've grown to dislike the game. I still love it and think the writing is some of the best in any RPG. But what I did start to realize more recently is how heavily the game leans on its charm. I wouldn't describe Devil May Cry, for example, as a game that depends for its fun factor on your liking the characters and enjoying the story. Devil May Cry barely has a story, and instead relies 100% on the inherent appeal of its combat system, which is fun almost no matter where you are or what you're fighting against. If you think Dante is an obnoxious, smug little puke stain with dialogue that makes Shadow the Hedgehog look like Hamlet, it doesn't matter. The game is still fun to play. In the Thousand Year Door, on the other hand, not only is the combat less integrated with other types of gameplay, but there are also lengthy periods during the story when you either don't engage in combat at all, or fight only against enemies that can be beaten in a really obvious way, meaning you don't have to turn your brain on during combat. The Great Boggly Tree, Twilight Town, the XS Express especially. Yes, there may be an awful lot of talking in Final Fantasy VIII, but there's never a point when it's just talking for 20 minutes at a stretch. There's always something else, something challenging, and even if you get frustrated by it, a challenge is always better than no challenge. The fact is, if you don't like Goombella and Koops and Grubba and Dupless and Flavio, if you don't find their personalities relatable and funny, it's a virtual certainty that you will not just dislike, but actively hate the Thousand Year Door. Where I think the Game Informer review went wrong was in attributing this distastefulness to witless writing, when really this is just wit that doesn't appeal to everybody. Which, when you get right down to it, is all wit. I don't care if you're talking about a clever turn of phrase in a short story or a joke told by a stand-up comedian. Nobody, but nobody, is charmed or amused by all the same things as someone else. There are certainly objective qualities that can give you a better chance of amusing someone. But even if you do everything right, there are people who just won't laugh. And it's not necessarily because they didn't get your joke. They just might not share your feelings. And it just so happens that part of the reason I now understand that old review of the Thousand Year Door more than I used to is that I feel very similarly about Mario and Luigi Brothership. Except for one thing. That review was from people who had absolutely no nostalgia for the game that the Thousand Year Door was a sequel to. And I suspect that they also weren't fans of the original game that all subsequent Mario RPGs were patterned after, Super Mario RPG. I, on the other hand, am a huge fan of what the Mario and Luigi series used to be. And I'm not seeing it in this new installment. Nintendo has had Mario star in various kinds of RPG for almost 30 years at this point. It's been such a long time that I think we've all sort of collectively forgotten how strange the idea of a Mario RPG actually was back in the mid-90s, when Mario was first and foremost the protagonist of a series of fast-paced, reflex-testing platformers. I'm not saying that Mario's brand identity was completely static back then, but he was far from the jack-of-all-genres that we know today. There had been spin-off Mario games up to this point, but most of them had a certain, cheapness about them? Having a trivia game or a typing tutor that featured Mario wasn't a big design challenge, because these are genres with very limited interactivity. There isn't actually much of a game there. An RPG, on the other hand, is a big proposition that demands a lot of thought. It means intricate storytelling, lots of unique characters and enemies, and gameplay that challenges players in a totally different way from what Nintendo was used to. It was such a huge design challenge, in fact, that Nintendo itself really wasn't up to it. The idea for Super Mario RPG came from a series of meetings between Nintendo and Squaresoft, the makers of Final Fantasy, in which Shigeru Miyamoto expressed his interest in making a Mario RPG, and his counterpart at Squaresoft, Chihiro Fujioka, expressed their interest in making something that would sell better outside Japan. In the end, the game was made pretty much exclusively by Squaresoft, with Nintendo's involvement being limited to Shigeru Miyamoto acting as the game's producer, and Kensuke Tanabe helping to write the story. I imagine that the result was a pleasant surprise to both Miyamoto and Fujioka when it released in mid-1996. Super Mario RPG exceeded Nintendo's sales projections in the US, and deservedly so because it's a pretty incredible game. The turn-based combat system wasn't exactly revolutionary, but the inclusion of action commands to do extra damage while attacking and reduce damage taken while defending was a stroke of genius. It makes the experience far more engaging, and mitigates the unpleasant randomness that can often make RPGs feel unfair. And while it doesn't quite feel like a perfect hybrid of platformer and RPG, an ideal that Nintendo would chase after for many years to come, it's still a very solid experience. The story is also innovative, and it introduced concepts to the Mario franchise that are still being put to good use today. This was the first game since Super Mario Bros. 2 to feature Peach as a protagonist with her own special powers. Plus now she can actually talk and participate in a proper story, instead of just floating around and throwing turnips at dinosaurs. It was also the first time that Bowser was forced into a reluctant alliance with the good guys to fend off an even greater threat that could destroy the whole Mushroom Kingdom. One interesting point is that after joining your party, Bowser is basically on the side of good for the whole rest of the game, while later Mario RPGs would make him more of a wild card, whose turns between heroism and villainy help to drive the plot. But honestly, I'm glad they didn't do that from the beginning. Start simple and build from there is a pretty good rule for character development. But if there's one quality that sells Super Mario RPG more than anything else for me, it's the game's earnestness. Looking at how quirky this world and the things that happen in it are, you might be inclined to take it less than seriously, but the characters never do that. To them, the stakes are high and the emotions are real. As a result, some plot developments can really catch you off guard, with sudden injections of pathos or menace that cut straight through the child-friendly presentation. When I think back on my time with Super Mario RPG, it's these moments that really stand out to me. Like entering Rosetown for the first time and seeing someone get shot with an arrow and stopped dead in their tracks, then having exactly the same thing happen to the next person you talk to, like it's some kind of curse. Or like Frogfucius telling Mallow that he's not really a tadpole, which makes him cry. Or an entire town filled with what looks like copies of the same creepy toad. And speaking of copies, how about the end of the game, where you find out that all of the villains you've been fighting this whole time are just mass-produced machines, cranked out endlessly by what can only be described as an assembly line of evil? Sure, the game is silly, but it never lets on that it knows how silly it is, and that gives it a kind of dignity. It's what makes heroes feel heroic, even when what they're fighting is a cake with googly eyes. It's what makes villains seem villainous, even when their evil plan is just to bounce around town on pogo sticks. It almost doesn't matter how bizarre a story is if you can frame it in a serious way. That's why suspension of disbelief is such a magical thing. This earnestness was something that Nintendo was careful to maintain in their next Mario RPG, Paper Mario, which came out in the year 2000 for the N64. They originally wanted Square to make this one too, but Square was kind of busy making, the most critically acclaimed JRPG in history, so they passed on this particular project. Instead, Nintendo turned to one of their oldest partners, Intelligent Systems, who weren't well known in the West at that time, but who were responsible for a little RPG series you may have heard of called Fire Emblem. Paper Mario was originally just called Super Mario RPG 2, and has always been known in Japan as Mario's Story. But despite these rather plain titles, the game itself is actually quite experimental. In a contemporary interview, the developers stated that they spent roughly half of their time just working on the combat system, but rather than complicating the original's approach, they went in the opposite direction, offering a basic distinction between jumping and hammering, with party members having only a few unique skills each, rather than a long, partly overlapping list of spells and abilities. There was also a conscious effort to give Paper Mario a different aesthetic feel from Super Mario RPG. The game's director, Ryota Kawade, used words like cozy and heartwarming to describe the intended effect, and said that he hoped battles would feel pleasant. The art style is obviously very different from both Super Mario RPG and most other RPGs, and the soundtrack is more atmospheric, even ambient sometimes, contrasting sharply with the previous game's more dramatic and exuberant soundtrack, provided by legendary Square composer Yoko Shimomura. Don't get me wrong, by the way, I love the music in both of these games, I just think Shimomura's is more memorable. And as Paper Mario continued into the 21st century, a trend began which started slowly but developed greater and greater momentum with each new installment. A trend of departing from established RPG conventions. Paper Mario had abandoned the classic Squaresoft menu system and made combat feel more like, well, a Mario game. But it had stuck with turn-based combat, multiple party members, depletable magic points, a leveling system, and many other traditional trappings of the genre that had been introduced with Super Mario RPG. 2004's The Thousand Year Door is the lone example in the series of moving closer to the standard, with partners having hit points and a greater emphasis on the overarching story. Paper Mario had more of a Monster of the Week approach across its various chapters. But then, in 2007, Super Paper Mario practically sprinted in the other direction. No more equipable badges. No more spells or magic points. No turn-based battles. Not in ordinary gameplay, at least. No more partners. There are multiple playable characters, but for obvious reasons, only one is on screen at a time. Even the leveling system is stripped down. Instead of choosing one of 3 stats to level up, now you automatically alternate between increased health and increased attack power. That's literally all you get. However, it was Sticker Star, which released for the 3DS in 2012, that really marked the point of no return for this series. Turn-based combat is technically reintroduced here, but it's been completely hollowed out and bears no resemblance to the system present in earlier games. On the other hand, the concept of leveling up, which is what made even the basic combat in Super Paper Mario worth engaging with, is out. Partners are still out, but now you can't even switch to another character with different abilities. Nor does Mario have anything comparable to the flip mechanic to add an extra dimension to overworld exploration. Named NPCs are out. Heck, even NPCs with newly created models are out. As for the story? Give me a break. There is no frickin' story. Super Paper Mario had a story that rambled all over the place, but at least the villains had a plan, and the heroes actually learned things that were relevant to the plot as they journeyed across dimensions. If Super Paper Mario's story is a plain ham and cheese sandwich, serviceable and maybe even tasty, but nothing exciting, then Sticker Stars is a stale cracker with a pinch of sugar sprinkled on top. Despite the fact that Sticker Star did, shockingly, sell quite well, better than the Thousand Year Door, actually, it was received pretty harshly by critics, and there was a substantial backlash against it for a few years. Nevertheless, in the decade plus since then, Nintendo has made no serious effort to restore the elements that Sticker Star stripped out. Instead, they've been taking baby steps toward a more coherent narrative, deeper characters, and a combat system that isn't completely mindless, while displaying a marked aversion to any design elements that weren't in Sticker Star, especially if they were in a Mario RPG before then. Based on what I've been saying this whole time, you might assume that I was devastated by these unwelcome changes. But the truth is that, for a few years at least, I hardly noticed them. As mentioned before, I actually quite enjoyed Super Paper Mario, and by the time Sticker Star released, I had pretty much checked out from caring about the Paper Mario series entirely. Because that classic RPG itch was still being scratched by a different Mario spin-off, one which began the year before the Thousand Year Door, and was still going strong a decade later. And if Nintendo thought that Sticker Star's financial returns proved that they were going in the right direction with Paper Mario, as of 2012, the most recent game in this series had sold nearly twice as many units as Sticker Star. It was created by ex-Square employees who had left to form their own studio in the year 2000, with a team that included both of the directors of Super Mario RPG, plus Tetsuo Mizuno, who had been the president of Squaresoft for 6 years during the 1990s. In a way, this new studio was Squaresoft. Not the epic, grandiose Squaresoft responsible for Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts, but the younger, quirkier Squaresoft that made games like Chrono Trigger and Super Mario RPG. That studio's name was AlphaDream, and the series which they created was called Mario and Luigi. Since so many of the leaders of AlphaDream were not just former Square employees, but pretty high-ranking Square employees, it's my opinion that the creation of Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga belongs to that strange and glorious era of gaming history that I refer to as that time when Square employees kept making games with Nintendo even though they told Sony they wouldn't, and also Sony literally owned 18% of their company. This is the same era that brought us Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles on the GameCube, perhaps the most flagrant example of Square's relentless loophole-seeking, as well as Sword of Mana, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, and the inimitable Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories. Okay, so technically the people at AlphaDream left before Square made any promises to Sony, but I still find it funny how much of Square's talent was reluctant to leave Nintendo behind, even as its commitment to weird storage media like cartridges and mini-discs practically forced their biggest franchises to move elsewhere. This company had like half of its most talented employees from the 90s working on Nintendo games by 2003. It is nuts. Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga wasn't the first game that AlphaDream developed, but it was the first to come out in the United States. And in a curious echo of the past, it also wasn't initially Nintendo's idea. It was AlphaDream, possibly inspired by seeing Nintendo go so far with Paper Mario, that came up with a pitch for a new game concept that would preserve more of Super Mario RPG's essence, while also taking it in a novel direction. They presented this idea to Nintendo's upper management, and apparently Satoru Iwata was quite impressed, because he immediately greenlit the project. This was actually the start of a tradition that would continue for the rest of AlphaDream's existence as a studio. Nintendo never asked for a new Mario and Luigi game from them at any point, Instead, they would just brainstorm on their own until they came up with a premise for the next installment, and then go to Nintendo to get it approved. If you've ever wondered why these games seemed to take so long to come out, it's probably because this system made it easy for Nintendo to shoot down potential projects that they didn't like. Of course, this might also explain why the series was so good for so long, because Nintendo never felt compelled to move forward with anything less than a great premise. And frankly, I'm not sure that any premise for a Mario RPG has ever been better than the one for Superstar Saga, at least from a gameplay perspective. Super Mario RPG had allowed you to use timed button presses to improve your attack and defense, and Paper Mario continued that tradition, but there hadn't yet been a game that made defending just as varied and active as attacking. Superstar Saga, however, did, by incorporating the jump and hammer moves into your responses to enemy attacks, thus making it feel like their turn was really just an extension of your turn. If you were good at dodging, you could now avoid taking any damage, and even slap a few points of damage on your opponent for having the temerity to approach you. Remember, this happened a year before Paper Mario introduced the concept of a super guard, so there was absolutely no precedent for something like this. And besides, this is way more engaging and interesting than the super guard anyway. That was just mashing a button with a slightly narrower time window than regular dodging. This was more like launching a counterattack and taking your foes completely by surprise. I've heard a few people say that the combat in this game is a little bit too easy, but I don't think that's actually true. What it is fluent. It's rhythmic. It only feels easy because, well, it's fun. One thing I've rarely heard people mention is that the areas in Superstar Saga have way more enemies bouncing around than in most RPGs, which would ordinarily be annoying. But based on my admittedly unscientific analysis, a typical random encounter in Superstar Saga is done in about half the time that it would take in, just to pick a totally random example, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. Lisa Mason, the Game Informer reviewer who was so uncharitable toward Thousand-Year Door, brought up Superstar Saga during her review of it, mostly to note how disappointing the former was compared to the latter. She said she had hoped that this new Paper Mario game would be like a big console version of Superstar Saga, and I think that word big is very telling, because it's certainly true that Superstar Saga is not a big game. You could easily finish it in 10 hours, even on a first playthrough. I don't think Lisa realized the extent to which Superstar Saga is fun precisely because it's small and the plot progresses quickly. The game gives you room to explore if you want to, but if you do only what the game tells you to, then there almost isn't time to get bored before the next interesting thing happens. This is the sense in which it comes closest to replicating Super Mario RPG, which also had a brisk pace with very little padding. But this is also the aspect of Superstar Saga's design that future Mario and Luigi games would ultimately move the farthest away from, in much the same way that Paper Mario left behind its RPG elements to become some bizarre hybrid of puzzle and action-adventure game. And to make the effect that this change had on the series crystal clear, I'm going to review the overall pacing and story structure of each of the first 4 Mario and Luigi games, which I played the first couple hours of recently to refresh my memory. Oh, and spoiler warning for all of these, naturally. Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga begins with Princess Peach's voice being stolen by a pair of mysterious miscreants who snuck into her castle by claiming to be ambassadors from the neighboring Bean Bean Kingdom. With her voice gone, Peach now emits speech bubbles filled with explosives, leading Bowser to conclude that she's not fit to be kidnapped in her present state. So he teams up with Mario and Luigi to invade the Bean Bean Kingdom and find out what's going on. Midway through the journey, they're confronted by the voice thieves, who it turns out are actually a beanish witch named Cackaletta and her sycophantic sidekick Fawful, who speaks in an unusual, stilted manner involving frequent use of food-related metaphors. The two of them scuttle Bowser's airship and send it crashing into the border country between the two kingdoms, dumping Bowser into a cannon which he soon gets shot out of, leading to blunt force trauma and temporary amnesia. Meanwhile, Mario and Luigi dust themselves off and cross the border into the Bean Bean Kingdom. They find themselves in a mountain town where some soldiers are looking for Prince Peasley, the son of their monarch, Queen Bean. Fawful then appears and prevents them from descending the mountain by dropping a rock in their path. So Mario and Luigi instead climb to the top, looking for a special stone which a smithy in town can turn into hammers. On the mountaintop, they encounter and defeat a dragon, which turns out to have been a kidnapped and transformed Prince Peasley. He invites them to visit Queen Bean's castle, where his mother will explain everything. Arriving at the castle, Mario and Luigi find it deserted except for a courtier who calls herself Lady Lima. Apparently suspicious of their motives, she drops them into the basement through a trapdoor and tells them they must prove their worth by fixing the castle's plumbing. Having done this, they unlock a cell and find inside it the real Lady Lima and her attendants. So it turns out the person that they met earlier was actually Cackaletta in another disguise. By fixing the plumbing, our heroes have unlocked the mechanism which protects the kingdom's greatest treasure, the Bean Star, which when awakened by a pure voice will grant any wish asked of it. Mario and Luigi escape the basement, only to be met by Cacaletta, who sicks a transformed Queen Bean on them and flies away to use Peach's voice on the Bean Star. They defeat the Queen, knocking her out still in her transformed state. Hoping to cure her, the two are led to the Chucklehuck Chateau and a magical restorative beverage that is said to be brewed there. While looking for this drink, Mario and Luigi encounter a master thief named Popple, who attacks them together with a suspiciously familiar assistant whom he calls Rookie. After fending them off and rescuing a pair of hostages, the duo ventures deep into the Chucklehuck woods, and ultimately finds the curative beverage. After being restored to her true form, Queen Bean reveals that Cacaletta must have flown off to the nearby Woohoo University, which has audio equipment that she can use to blare Peach's voice at the Beanstar until it awakens. Hot on her trail, Mario and Luigi head for the University, only to find that Cacaletta has either terrorized or transformed all of its inhabitants and locked herself up in an inner chamber. Through a series of maneuvers, they manage to break the lock and burst into the room just as Peach's voice begins to play. But oddly, rather than awakening normally at the sound of her voice, the Beanstar turns red and throws a fit, bashing the room to bits and then finally dropping through a hole in the floor. Cacaletta is furious that her plan has failed, and becomes even more enraged when Luigi floors Fawful with a single hammer swing. Flying into a rage, she attacks our heroes, but is soundly defeated. On the brink of death, Cacaletta is saved only by the quick thinking of Fawful, who vacuums up her spirit into his headgear and flees the scene. Mario and Luigi rush down to the University's bottom floor, where they find Popple and Rookie trying to filch the Beanstar for themselves. After another tense battle, the recording of Peach's voice plays again, filling the Beanstar with anger and causing it to begin rising through the air. Mario, Luigi, Popple, and Rookie all grab hold of it and try to keep it from flying away, but it proves too powerful and lifts them all up instead. One by one, each is torn away from the Beanstar and falls to the ground below, leaving only Rookie. Under the intense stress, he suddenly regains his memory and realizes he is Bowser, but only for an instant before he too is cast aside, and the Beanstar splinters into several fragments which spread across the Bean Kingdom. Now, all of this, everything I just said, takes place over the span of about 4 hours, and it's easily half of the game's story. There's still a lot to come at this point, including the acquisition of the elemental hand powers, which for some reason are unique to Superstar Saga. I can't imagine why the other games don't have them, they were great, but who can fathom the mind of an ex-Square employee? However, a lot has also already happened in this short time, not just story-wise, but also in terms of gameplay. Mario and Luigi learn their first Bros moves, the high jump and the spin jump, while crossing the border about a half hour into the experience. They get hammers less than an hour later after climbing the mountain, and the Bros moves that use hammers about a half hour after that. By about 2 hours and change into Superstar Saga, the player already has a nearly complete toolkit of battle moves, and is able to start searching the overworld for optional upgrades, like beans and special gear. 2 hours. There are lots of games that aren't even done with the introduction by then. For instance, Bowser's Inside Story is to this day the best-selling Mario and Luigi game, and if you play it for more than a few minutes, it's easy to see why. The setting elements, characters, and dialogue are every bit as creative and charming as Superstar Saga, but thanks to the increased power of the Nintendo DS, the art, and especially the animations, stand out even more. With the combat, AlphaDream held on to all the clever details from before, and added even more to tinker with and enjoy. I particularly like the use of the vacuum block, which lets you fight the same enemy as both Bowser and the Mario Brothers, with 2 completely different sets of attacks. And as that last sentence and the game's title both suggest, the premise here is also quite, outlandish. Bowser's Inside Story begins with a newspaper account of a dreadful disease that's sweeping the Mushroom Kingdom, known as the Blorbs. Toads who get infected with the Blorbs swell up into huge balls and become unable to move, except by gravity, of course. A meeting is held at Peach's castle to discuss the problem, attended by several Toad doctors, as well as Mario, Luigi, and a female star sprite named Starlo, who's been sent there to help. It is pointed out that all the blorbed toads seem to share one thing in common. They ate an infected mushroom of unknown origin shortly before falling sick. Suddenly, the meeting is interrupted by, who else, Bowser, who gets his tail thoroughly thrashed by Mario and is launched out of the castle into the surrounding woods. The game then shifts to Bowser's perspective, and follows him as he skulks off, accompanied by his loyal minion Kamek. When out of nowhere, he runs across a booth in the middle of the woods, operated by a strange hooded figure who talks in a curiously stilted manner. The hooded figure tells Bowser that he has won a special lucky mushroom that will enable him to get the best of Mario, and urges him to eat it right away. Despite Kamek's reservations, Bowser chomps down on the mushroom and instantly begins to feel sick, whereupon the hooded figure sheds his disguise and reveals himself to be Fawful, Cacoletta's minion from the first game, now engaged in a mission to take over the world for himself. Moments later, Bowser begins to uncontrollably inhale everything around him into his stomach. Against his own will, he's propelled toward Peach's castle again, where he ingests all of its contents, including people, then collapses in exhaustion and passes out. Mario awakens inside Bowser's body, discovering it to be a labyrinth of bizarre arteries, channels, and organs. After he saves Starlo and Luigi from Bowser's digestive enzymes, the trio make their way out of the stomach and realize that Bowser is now unconscious. Blocked from making any further progress within Bowser's body, our heroes realize that they need his help to find a way out of him, so they locate and activate a nerve to wake him up. Bowser regains consciousness in a musty cave, unknown either to him or the castaways inside his body. Confused and angry, he's at first unwilling to listen to anyone's advice, but Starlo ultimately manages to establish a rapport with him by pretending to be a disembodied voice named Chippy. Bowser leaves the cave and is immediately confronted by Fawful, who taunts him by revealing his grand plan to take over Bowser Castle and make it the center of his empire. He then summons his own minion, a pig-like creature called Midbus, to take Bowser down. Bowser puts up a good fight, but with most of his powers gummed up by the tainted mushroom, he is unable to defeat Midbus, who runs off with Fawful to continue with their plan of world conquest. Bowser leaves the cave and finds himself on a sandy beach, where a man made out of blocks is calling for help from a nearby island. With Mario and Luigi helping to activate his arm muscles, Bowser is able to rescue the block man, who expresses his thanks and offers Bowser a special vacuum block as a reward, which will let him, now voluntarily, inhale his opponents. Unbeknownst to him, they're then encountered and fought by Mario and Luigi inside his body. From this point onwards, the story advances on two fronts, with Mario and Luigi exploring the rest of Bowser's body to help him regain his lost powers, while Bowser uses those powers to cross the wilderness separating him from his castle. In the process, he reunites with three of his underlings, who are mounting their own effort to retake Bowser's castle from the forces of Fawful. Bowser's brigade launches an assault on the castle, only to discover that Midbus has turned it into an enormous flying battleship. With Mario and Luigi's help, Bowser becomes gigantic himself and fights the castle mano a mano, forcing it back down to the ground. Upon entering the castle, Bowser and the Bros discover that Fawful has converted the interior into a theater to brainwash Bowser's minions into following his orders. Enraged, Bowser crashes into the middle of a performance and is once again confronted by Midbus, and a proper fight between the two bruisers begins. Bowser wins this fight, but is then tricked by Fawful into eating so much food as a prize that he becomes incredibly fat and sinks into the floor, immobilizing him. With this, we have now gone over roughly the first 4 hours of the game, which is also where we stopped with Superstar Saga. So let's compare the two and see how far each story goes in that time. In Superstar Saga, these 4 hours gave us an introductory problem, Peach's voice being stolen, revealed the villain responsible, Cacoletta, had our heroes rescue two major characters from Cacoletta's enchantments, Prince Peasley and Queen Bean, showed the plot device which drives most of the story, the Beanstar, and culminated in a fight with the main villain, which our heroes win decisively. This 4-hour stretch could, dramatically speaking, stand alone as a complete story. It would leave a few loose narrative ends dangling, but there's a real sense of closure at this point. The second half of the story is almost like a sequel to the first half, rather than a mere continuation of it. By contrast, 4 hours of Bowser's Inside Story gives us two introductory problems, the Blorbs and Bowser inhaling the Mario Brothers, reveals the villain responsible, Fawful, has Bowser rescue Broke Monsieur, who's not strictly relevant to the plot, and three of his own minions, who are plot relevant but don't do much, does not show the plot device which drives most of the story, and culminates in a fight against the main villain's underling, which Bowser wins, but also technically loses because he's an idiot and allows himself to be sidetracked by food. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is bad storytelling, although it does involve more contrivance and is a little harder to take seriously. And admittedly, this arbitrary cutoff point of 4 hours is slightly unfair to Bowser's Inside Story, because about a half hour later, the central plot device, the Dark Star, which could give Fawful untold power, is revealed after the Mario Brothers find Peach inside Bowser's body. What this is slow storytelling. There are very few quick setups and payoffs in Bowser's Inside Story. Instead, a lot of mysteries and complications appear in the first 5 hours or so, and most of them get resolved one after the other as the game winds up in its last few hours. Some of it honestly strikes me as a little clumsy. For instance, the plot device that opens up the barrier to Fawful's castle near the end of the game is the same thing as the ultimate cure for the Blorbs. My problem with that isn't that it's hard to believe. That would be a stupid objection to any plot development in a franchise this wacky. But rather that it just feels emotionally unsatisfying to kill two birds with one stone like this. especially when one of these problems has a ton of dramatic weight and meaning associated with it, and the other has essentially none. It's just a locked door. But that doesn't mean that the writing problems in the Mario and Luigi series can't get a lot worse than this. Mario and Luigi Dream Team was the first game in the series to debut on the 3DS, and with that jump in processing power came an entirely new aesthetic, increased mobility and spectacle during the combat sections, and, unfortunately, a marked regression in the quality of the storytelling. Where Bowser's inside story could be a little ponderous in developing its plot, Dream Team is downright narcoleptic. And this is a serious shame, because in almost every other way, Dream Team is a shining example of classic AlphaDream design. It's got an interesting setting, funny dialogue, and great combat, not to mention a lot of interesting mechanics, particularly in the dream world, where a little less than half of the game takes place. But if this game has a weak spot, it's definitely the story, which starts sluggishly and only occasionally works up a head of steam that puts it on the same level as its predecessors. After Brothership came out, there were more than a few people noting that it was hardly unique among Mario and Luigi games in getting off to a slow start. And yeah, that's undeniable. I would argue that Dream Team doesn't really pick up until about 4 or 5 hours have passed, long after both Superstar Saga and Bowser's Inside Story have begun to flesh out their stories. But, to be fair, let's go over what does happen up to that point. Dream Team begins with Mario, Luigi, Peach, and an entire castle's worth of Toads taking a vacation to Pillow Island, having been invited there by its resident somnologist, Dr. Snoozemore. En route, Luigi falls asleep and has a nightmare in which their blimp is attacked by a shadowy presence, but he's soon shaken awake, and he and Mario disembark to find that a massive celebration has been arranged for them, which takes the form of a tutorial as they make their way to the castle at the island's center. Part of the castle is an active archaeological site, and through a misunderstanding, Peach accidentally boards a moving platform that takes her deep into the ruins. Mario and Luigi give chase and catch up to her in an underground chamber containing an odd pillow-shaped rock, which they decide to take back to the castle's museum. Luigi, already exhausted by the day's events, puts the pillow down on a bed inside the museum, then rests his head on it and falls asleep. The rest of the gang has a brief discussion about the ancient Pillow people who once inhabited the island, when suddenly a colorful portal appears above Luigi's dozing form, and Peach gets drawn through it as if by magic. Mario jumps into the portal as well, and after swimming through what looks like a massive rainbow-colored cloud, he emerges at the other end in a surreal, otherworldly version of the castle that he and Luigi were just exploring a few minutes ago. Mario is later told that this is a dream world, which has existed on the island since time immemorial, and because he entered it through Luigi's dreams, it reflects Luigi's innermost thoughts. Luigi's own image of himself, known as Dreamy Luigi, then pops up to assist Mario, and together they rush to save the princess from the shadowy presence that has abducted her. The shadow summons an evil, dreamy version of Mario to stop them, which they defeat, but not in time to rescue Peach from the depths of the dream. However, by breaking a nightmare chunk, Mario is able to leave the dream himself, at the same time freeing a consciousness which was trapped inside the stone pillow. It turns out that the pillow was actually the body of one of the island's former inhabitants, Prince Dreambird, who expresses his gratitude for their help, but rushes off to find and free his subjects before they can ask him any questions. The bros follow Prince Dreambird south to Mushrise Park, but on their way the wooden bridge that connects it to the castle splinters to pieces and dumps them back into the castle catacombs. Here they find another stone pillow, and by having Luigi rest his head on it and fall asleep, which he can apparently do on demand at any time, they return to the dream world and free the mind of another member of the Pillow people. Prince Dreambird then arrives, and confesses that he was unable to help his subjects on his own. He tells Mario and Luigi that long ago there were 2 stones of great power on Pillow Island, the Dream Stone, which contains the power of dreams, and the Dark Stone, which contains the power of nightmares. Antasma, the evil king of bats, wished to steal the Dark Stone to grant his malicious desires, and although Dreambird and his people succeeded in trapping Antasma in the dream world, just before he was sealed away, he crushed the Dark Stone into pieces, which rained down on the Pillows, instantly rendering them unconscious and turning their bodies to stone. Prince Dreambird asks the bros to help him rescue the other Pillows, offering in return to assist them in rescuing Peach. He notes particularly that the wisest Pillow of all, AlphaDream, would likely know where Peach has been taken. Sensing him to be somewhere in Mushrise Park, he leads the party back that way. The party spots AlphaDream immediately, but unfortunately he's been picked up by Boss Brickle, the park's manager, who is busy repairing the park's facilities after a recent hail of boulders and refuses to talk to them until his work is done. After a series of wacky mishaps, including a boss battle against a gardening robot that goes crazy after being hit in the head, Mario and Luigi earn Boss Brickle's trust, and he agrees to let them have AlphaDream. Luigi goes to sleep once more, and Mario enters his dream, which has now become a warped version of Mushrise Park, complete with an imagined Boss Brickle who interferes with their attempts to save AlphaDream. At the same time, Bowser appears in the real world and stomps his way over to where Luigi is sleeping. Upon learning that Peach has been taken inside Luigi's dreams, he vaults into the portal himself to go after her. After AlphaDream is freed, he tells Mario and dreamy Luigi that Peach is being held in Dreams Deep, the lowest and most essential level of the dream world, and opens a path that will take Mario there. Upon reaching the bottom, he discovers Phantasma and Bowser plotting together. Mario pulls Peach away from them, but is unable to defeat their combined power and is knocked out. Bowser still wants to kidnap Peach at this point, but Phantasma convinces him not to because... actually, he doesn't give a proper reason. He just says that they need to stick to his evil plan, and anyway, they can always kidnap her later. I don't know why he would pass up such an easy opportunity to have a bargaining chip in his hands, since it's already clear to him how much Peach means to Mario and Luigi, but whatever. And yeah, that's the first 4 hours of Dream Team. A little while later, the team learns that Bowser and Phantasma are going after the Dream Stone in another part of the island, but it takes another couple of hours for that development to really start paying off. Perhaps you've already noticed how much of the synopsis for this game's opening is just people talking to each other, without really doing much of anything. If you haven't, then let me be the first to tell you that a lot of Dream Team's story is just people talking to each other without really doing much of anything. And because you're not doing much, the game doesn't give you many tools to do stuff with until fairly late in the experience. In Superstar Saga, it only took 2 hours for the game to hand over the hammers, as well as 4 special Bros moves and their associated attacks. Bowser's inside story was a little stingier, but you still get the hammers inside of an hour, and a steady drip feed of new abilities for both the Bros and Bowser during hours 2 through 5. But in Dream Team, it would take most players more than 2 hours just to get the hammers in Mushrise Park. You don't get your first Bros moves until the Dozing Desert, which I didn't even get to in the first 4 hours. So how about a high jump? I mean, after all, that's the first move you get in Superstar Saga, before you've even made it to the kingdom where the game is set. Well, forget about it. Oh, you get shown ledges that you need a high jumping ability to get to as early as Mushrise Park, but the move itself isn't learned until the second time you climb Mount Pajamaja, about 12 hours in. 12. You could finish Bowser's Inside Story in less time than it takes this game to give you the high jump. This is the first point in the series where I would say that pacing has become a legitimate problem. It's not that the game is too long, not even necessarily that it doesn't do enough to hold your interest. It's that most of what it does do is either a one-off gimmick, or at best, a gimmick that recurs half a dozen or so times, with most of the really interesting stuff happening inside the dream world. The overworld exploration just doesn't have any core mechanics that are really fleshed out, which at times gives it a curiously empty feeling despite the fantastic art design. And yet, things can still get a lot worse from here. Okay, so I may have misled you a little bit when I said that I played through the beginnings of the first 4 Mario and Luigi games as preparation for this video. The truth is that I did not play any part of Mario and Luigi Paper Jam, because I have never bought Mario and Luigi Paper Jam, because everything I heard about Mario and Luigi Paper Jam when it released caused me to weep and rend my garments. But I did watch a few hours of it being played, and here's what I gleaned from that experience. The basic premise of Paper Jam is that Luigi finds an old book one day in the library of Peach's castle, and when he opens it, all of the inhabitants of the papery world inside spill out and start causing trouble in the Mario and Luigi world, including Paper Mario, Paper Peach, acres of paper toads, and of course Paper Bowser and his mache minions. But not Paper Luigi for some odd reason. Given his past history in the Paper Mario games, I have to assume that he didn't even notice the book had opened, because he was off doing something really important, like making soup, or opening Paper Mario's fan mail and readdressing it to himself. Anyway, Paper Bowser teams up with his non-paper, non-union equivalent. The two of them invade the Mushroom Kingdom and kidnap both Peaches, and Mario, Luigi, and Paper Mario team up to get them back. Along with Starlo, who at this point I guess is just hanging out in the Mushroom Kingdom full-time because she doesn't have anything better to do. So that's the premise. That is also, essentially, the first 4 hours of the game, which makes this section of the video easy to write at least, but it's more than a bit disappointing after the standards set by every previous game in this series. Now you would think that a crossover between Mario and Luigi and Paper Mario would be something of a no-brainer, and that it would be really easy to come up with neat ideas for how these two game systems could interact. The only trouble with that idea, of course, is that they didn't do that. The only Paper Mario game that Paper Jam is based on to any significant extent was the most recent one, Sticker Star. And like Sticker Star, it's far more conspicuous for what's lacking in it than for what's there. The combat system is the best part of the game, but that's because it's literally the same system from Dream Team with a few extra bells and whistles stapled on top. Neither the classic turn-based Paper Mario combat system, nor, thankfully, the horrendous sticker-based system from Sticker Star appear to have had any influence on the combat whatsoever. But in addition, there's no new overall setting. It's just the Mushroom Kingdom, and the individual levels follow very well-worn Mario cliches, like Grassland, Desert Land, and so on. There aren't any new villains in this game. It's just Bowser and Paper Bowser. There are no new types of NPC, and in fact, this sounds insane even as I'm saying it, there are also no recurring special NPC types from any game in either the Mario and Luigi series or the Paper Mario series, even though the whole conceit of this game is merging the two worlds together. It's like they refused to allow anything into this game that didn't appear in, like, New Super Mario Bros. For the DS. Not even the later games in that series. I mean the mediocre original one, that was only popular because nobody had played a 2D Mario game in 11 years. The game is freaking full of toads, but as in Sticker Star, these are just generic funny toads with no name and paper-thin personalities. You know what? I am actually being too harsh here. There is one toad in this game that's special. It's Toadette. She's in this game. She makes stuff out of paper for you, and later on she gets kidnapped by the bad guys. That's the rule in Paper Jam. You have a unique personality, you get kidnapped. I'm amazed Starlo doesn't get kidnapped at some point. It's like Bowser is the one enforcing all these shitty creative restrictions. He's like, off to the dungeon with you. I won't be satisfied until this kingdom is as generic as goddamn possible. Unless Brothership sells less than 1 million copies, which I would consider unlikely, even with some of the backlash it's received, Paper Jam is going to go down as the worst-selling Mario and Luigi game ever. Probably the worst-performing Mario RPG ever. And as I like to say, it couldn't have happened to a better game. Because if it was a better game, it wouldn't have happened. So really, whether you like Brothership or not, you should probably thank your lucky star sprites that it turned out as well as it did. I don't know if Paper Jam's design is the result of poor judgment on AlphaDream's part, or a ruthless creativity crackdown on Nintendo's, but either way, it came out with AlphaDream's name on it, and I'm not surprised that it more or less took them down with it when it failed. So we return to the million-dollar question. Based on what its forerunners in the series were like, is Brothership a good Mario and Luigi game? I'll be right up front here and tell you that my answer is no, but I don't feel nearly as strongly about that judgment as I do about Paper Jam. Brothership is a tactical retreat from some of the more boneheaded decisions that characterized that game, but in every other way I see it as a logical progression of the trends that produced Dream Team a decade ago, which is not a good thing. In my opinion, Brothership suffers from all the problems that Dream Team did, combined with a handful of those found in Paper Jam, and more than a handful that are unique to it. Now, some of these problems that I have with the game are highly subjective, and I acknowledge that, but there are a lot of them. To start with, I hate this game's soundtrack. It's not that the music is outright bad, I just find it bland and really low-key, like a cross between old Rick Steves travel specials and educational children's television from the 70s, with just a smidge of the Bomberman Jetters soundtrack. Actually, it's pretty uncanny how much this game's whole aesthetic reminds me of Bomberman Jetters, but I think that's definitely a me thing. The one theme that I can really get into is the Rumbla Island theme, because first of all, it doesn't use that freaking accordion that plagues the game's first 8 hours, and second of all, it actually builds up some, excuse the play on words, energy that is sorely lacking in many areas. The fact is that every previous Mario and Luigi game had a soundtrack composed by Yoko Shimomura, the same woman who provided music for the original Super Mario RPG, and not only is she a very tough act to follow, this also means that Mario and Luigi used to have a very recognizable and distinct musical identity that Brothership just stomps all over with its giant accordion-filled boots. Then, of course, there's the new art direction, which I've heard a lot of people gush about, even people who seem to dislike the rest of the game, and honestly, I'm just not seeing the appeal. This reminds me a little bit of Pokemon, a little bit of Kirby, and only slightly of any previous Mario and Luigi game. I mean, I guess the animations are above average, and that deserves praise because it is an easy thing to mess up, but a lot of this stuff stops looking good to me the instant it stops moving around. And seriously, I get that the whole theme of the game is electrical stuff, but did they have to make every NPC's face an outlet? It means they all have like 2 facial expressions, mildly amused, and oh boy, that was cringe. I mean, that's one more expression than some of the NPCs in Dream Team had, but this is on a home console, and you have to stare into these people's faces for hours on end. Surely we can do better at this point. Even Superstar Saga had a distinction between the Hooligans and the Beanish people. As for problems that it shares in common with Paper Jam, one really obvious one is the writing, which has been pretty dire in both of the major Mario RPG franchises ever since Sticker Star came out. The one major exception to that is Dream Team, and I'm not referring to the plot-related writing here because I think that's actually quite bad, But the character dialogue there is a lot of fun, and it helps to smooth over the parts of the plot that don't exactly work. Brothership has a few moments like that too, but most of what I've seen from it is pretty generic, childish fare. And as the IGN review pointed out, the NPCs have this distressing tendency to restate and over-explain everything that happens, not to mention repeating jokes that are barely funny the first time and eventually become excruciating. I get it, Snoutlet. You're not a pig. You look and sound exactly like one, but you aren't one. Can we please move past this point in our relationship? You are the worst sidekick ever, and you are actually making me miss Starlo. Do you realize that? Her entire existence is based on making Luigi's life a living hell, and she is still funnier than you. Another paper jammy problem is an over-reliance on gimmicks to keep the player engaged, although at least Brothership has a real plot underneath all those gimmicks. In fact, the core of the game, both mechanically and story-wise, is generally pretty strong. Even the 5 out of 10 IGN reviewer admitted that the combat was creative and a lot of fun. It's just the aesthetic misfires and the lame writing that lets it down and makes it hard to like. Oh, and also the Dream Team problems, specifically awkward and sluggish pacing and severe tonal whiplash. Dream Team had a big tone problem. An hour into the story, Princess Peach gets kidnapped, and the response of all the Toads, who I would remind you she is the monarch of, is nothing. Not only are they not upset about this development, they don't even talk about it. They're all still acting like this is just a fun vacation, chatting about all the wonderful tourist spots on this delightful little island, and I just want to shake them by their stupid mushroom caps and shout, "Your princess is in another castle! Aren't you worried?" For at least the first 8 hours of Dream Team, the tone is almost completely chill and relaxing. This is a problem not just because it can get boring, but also because things happen over these 8 hours that really ought to be taken more seriously than literally everyone involved in this story is taking them. When you get to the end of Dozing Sands, for instance, Bowser and Phantasma have taken the Dreamstone and are flying off into the distance. As far as we know, the Dreamstone has the power to grant any wish, and there's no restrictions on this power, like with the Beanstar from Superstar Saga. You don't have to wake it up or anything. The game doesn't tell you that Bowser and Phantasma have to wait for it to charge up. So as far as you're concerned, when they do this, they've won. And Prince Dreambird is just like, oh well, that's unfortunate. Hey, maybe we can go into the memory of where the stone was and that'll tell us where they took it. It's like, please worry about this a little. As far as you know, the world is ending. Come on, man. It's the combination of poor overall plot structuring and a few critical plot holes that makes Dream Team's story a chore to try and engage with. And I suspect that many players, like me, were more invested in finding funny characters to interact with, like the Massive Brothers, than they were in trying to defeat the main villain of the game. As far as I can tell, Brothership has fewer plot holes than Dream Team, but that's not enough to save it from the devastation of unbelievably slow pacing. The clearest way in which Brothership is the endpoint of an ongoing trend is how interminably long it takes to evolve both its gameplay and its story. If we compare it to the other games on the 4-hour basis that I established earlier, I watched a popular streamer play Brothership for about 4 hours, and by the end of it, he had just gotten the hammers about 15 minutes before. If you're a little quicker, you can get that and a single bros move, the UFO spin, during that period, as well as fighting one boss. To recap, Superstar Saga had you get the hammers and 4 bros moves in the same amount of time, while fighting 7 bosses. Bowser's Inside Story gave you the hammers and a bros move and a bunch of Bowser powers, including the vacuum block, while fighting 6 bosses. 7 if you count the fight with Broke Monsieur. And Dream Team provided the hammers and a bunch of Dreamy Luigi powers, and saw you square off against 4 bosses. That's already not great, and Brothership pushes this to the brink of absurdity. I'm sorry, but if players feel compelled to say things like, the game gets good 8 hours in, that means the game is bad. Not completely bad, but good pacing is one of the criteria by which a game should be judged, and if you get that wrong, don't be surprised when people lose patience with the result. Nobody should have to grit their teeth the first 3 times they boot up your game, and resign themselves to not having fun for 8 hours in order to get to the good part, no matter how long that good part lasts. However, all that being said, I am not willing to go along with IGN completely and say that this is an outright bad game. I think that fundamentally this game has a solid core, and if I don't like it as much as Dream Team, that's largely based on taste, and I understand how for some people the comparison goes completely the other way. If you put a gun to my head and forced me to play through Mario and Luigi Brothership, I'm sure that I would be able to have some fun with it. Maybe even enough fun that I would forget I had a gun pointed at my head. Unless you put it right up against my face, in which case, rude. And despite my criticisms, this really has made me optimistic for the future of the Mario and Luigi franchise. Acquire is still trying to get a grip on how to make a Mario RPG, and that's okay. As long as they keep striving to improve, I'm sure that within the next decade they'll put out something that impresses me, whether or not Yoko Shimomura has anything to do with it. They're on the right track, and I hope they can push through to the light at the end of the tunnel that the track is in. And maybe next time they make a Mario RPG, I won't have to talk your ear off about every previous game in the Mario and Luigi series just to show how far it falls short. What do you mean? Of course I did. Superstar Saga, Bowser's Inside Story, Dream Team, Paper Jam. What about Oh. Whoops. Well, what do you know? I forgot to talk about Partners in Time, just like how AlphaDream forgot to remake it back in the late 2010s, and then never got a chance to because they went out of business. Actually, you know what? This might be a good thing, because I have a lot to say about Partners in Time, and if any Mario RPG is the exact opposite of Brothership in almost every way, it's that. So yeah, let's talk about it. But not in this video. I think if there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that this video is way too long and I need a drink. Why don't you have a drink too? The more the merrier. Just don't drink too much or you may have an accident when this pops up on screen. See you later.